Hey, everybody, this is Harvey Sluggo Wasserman back with you for the Green Grassroots Emergency Election Protection Coalition Zoom call, the GREEP or GREE-GREE, number 139. We have been doing this since April of 2020, and a lot of history, a lot of water has passed under and over the dam. We're starting out with 36 people. It's great to have everybody with us. We have a tremendous honor today of having the former governor of Alabama, Don Siegelman, with us. And Don has an incredible story to tell and some real direction to give us on into the future. Don, you're a tremendous inspiration. I'm sure you'll join Dennis Bernstein on his radio show to come and many others. We're just very honored to have you with us. We're also going to be joined by John Brakey, the great election protection activist in Arizona, who has a lot to share with you, Governor Siegelman. And so it's going to be an action-packed first hour. We're also joined by Vinny DiStefano, who with Wendy Lederman works very prominently on the Julian Assange case. And it's very powerful that you're all with us to get off to the start. John Brakey has just joined us from Arizona. And he has had, there are a few people in the world who have had as big an impact as John Brakey has had on our elections in this country. And it's a very great honor to be able to tie you two together. John, how you doing? Wave to the audience here. And the second hour, we're going to start talking, as we often do, about nuclear power and renewable energy. I had the great misfortune last Friday to actually see the Oliver Stone movie on nuclear power. It's even worse than you could imagine, an absolute abomination. And we're joined by Ron Leonard, one of the great godfathers of the renewable energy industry, a major player in solar and wind. And he will be talking with me and others about the energy situation in this country. We're also joined here by Emily Levy. Hi, Emily, the founder and leader of the Scrutineers Organization, which deals deeply in election protection and other such issues. So, and I want to say that we're joined by your fellow Alabaman, a native of Mobile, I believe, Ruth Strauss. Ruth, I'm going to unmute you. You are probably the only two people on the call from Alabama. Ruth, do you want to say hi to Governor Siegelman? Can we hear you, Ruth? All right, we'll get this squared away soon. So, Governor Siegelman, you were governor of Alabama at the turn of the century. You had a horrendous experience with Karl Rove and the so-called justice system that we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But before we start with you, I do want to introduce you to HEDY TRIPP in St. Cloud, Minnesota, at the other end of the country. HEDY is a great election activist and wants to give us a 3-minute report on a study being done on election rights. So Asian Americans in the 2022 midterm elections. HEDY, can you tell us what this is about, please?
Yes, and I will do that very quickly. This is a new report, an insight into how Asian Americans voted in the 2022 midterm. It was done by AAJC, that's Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and that is based in Washington, D.C. Now, first of all, as most of you know, the term Asian Americans just lumps together everybody from, more than 50 countries that are in Asia, and probably thousands of dialects and languages and cultures. Sluggo, you have firsthand in your travels, especially in Indonesia, of how that is. And I am originally from the island of Singapore, but here in America, Asians are lumped together. I'm going to jump to a few slides. Let's see, 4. They did the survey from November to December 2022 with 2,800 Asian Americans. And what I'm doing today for you is just to give you just a little window into how this is important as you share, as you support Asian groups who work in increasing voting in these communities. Now, Mike Hirsch has the original slides, the presentation, and the report. So if you need more details, please go to him. I'm gonna go to slide 10. One of the issues was that 1 in 6 felt threatened when they voted. And the highest were Asian American Indians, and those aged from 18 to 30, and those with high school degrees or less. So keep that in mind. Asian Indians, probably because they were targeted during 9/11. Now, 2 in 3 voted early and did absentee voting. This is a little bit difficult to try and find the slides for you. Let me go to slide 30. Slide
You have to
28.
remember, Hetty, we're on the radio, so you want to be very
Correct.
explicit about
Yes,
what you're showing us.
right. So these are the top reasons for voting early and absentee. And this is coming from these Asian Americans that were surveyed. Long lines, limited hours during election day, COVID, of course, flexibility of being absent, election day scheduling conflicts, so that is included. Harassment and intimidation, as I said, 1 in 6 feel threatened. And then again, 1 in 10 unsure of where to vote.
So intimidation was clearly a
Correct.
significant factor. 12% of people being intimidated. Virtually every election in this country is decided by less than 12%. So clearly it can have an impact on the elections.
Correct.
Okay.
Let me do 2 more slides. 37. I'm going forward to slide 37. Sorry about this. 5, 6, and 7. All right. And here is, I think, the most important in terms of working with Asian American communities is in-language assistance. Again, you know, there's so many languages and cultures that you have to reach Asian Americans through their own language. Notice that naturalized voters slightly likelier than US voters to say that the language assistant is helpful because they're still working with their own language. And that makes sense, right, Sluggo?
Yes, yes. And in fact, this is a significant factor in 2024. In 2004 in Ohio, many precincts, which were majority Spanish-speaking, were not provided with Spanish-speaking assistance as was required by law. And this was a major complaint about the legitimacy of the election in Ohio 2004, is that Spanish-speaking districts were not supplied with poll workers who could speak Spanish. So obviously this carries over to the Asian language community as well.
And that's just one language, right? And this has many other levels. And then I want to just go to the last slide. Sorry about this. And again, you can contact Mike Hirsch to find out the details in this. All right, so here is the report's conclusion. To be able to have access to the vote, this is what Asian Americans were saying, universal, no excuse, absentee voting must be available to them. Older people vote by mail. They do want to do early voting because, again, of that intimidation and providing language access. Also, they were saying there was a lot of what they felt was disinformation. They were wanting more accurate information on candidates and also better candidates. That makes sense too.
Well, you know what Mark Twain said?
Okay,
if God had wanted us to have elections, he would have provided us with candidates.
Community education and engagement. This is interesting. They were getting most of their information through Facebook and YouTube.
my
So
God.
these are the two pieces that they were getting that. So that's basically it. Very fast struggle for you, but the details can be obtained from Mike.
Thank you very much, HEDY TRIPP. I think that this information actually, though it comes from the Asian American community, is pretty generic and really applies to all elections. So we will use that. Thank you. George Ripley has asked if there's a link to the report. Maybe you can put it in the chat. That would be great.
I will leave that to Mike to do that.
Okay, Mike and Steve, if you can put the link to that report in the chat. Thank you, Hetty. That was very helpful. We really appreciate it. Okay, and it's always great to see you, La. Okay, thank you so much. Governor Siegelman, we're going to welcome you back. I want to have the honors done by a native Alabaman. Is it Alabaman or Alabamian? Ruth Strauss, you want to say hi to your former governor here?
I do. And I also want to say that when my high school girlfriends got together for lunch last Christmas, we were at the Bluegill, which is a seafood dive. And right at the register, there was a T-shirt in a glass box that said "Free Don Siegelman." I just thought it was great. And I'll make a comment at the end too about where people can find more information, Scott Horton articles. Thank you.
And Ruth, you grew up in Mobile, right? Okay. All right. You're from Mobile?
Got it.
I am. Yeah, we both are. Yes.
You're from Mobile too. Well, maybe you knew the Ruth Strauss family in Mobile. Okay. So Don Siegelman, you are the former governor of Alabama. You have an incredible story to tell. Can you give us a sort of a thumbnail of the picture of your career and what was done to you and what you want to tell us about today?
Well, it's, I'd rather not necessarily dwell on my case, although I'll go through it real quickly. I was Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor. I had landed 5 automobile plants. We had secured the largest single land purchase to protect the Mobile Delta. I had been touted by the Kiplinger letter as a dark horse candidate to run against George W. Bush in 2004. All I needed to do was win re-election, and that's when Alabama, little known as being important in national elections, became a political battleground. I was investigated by Karl Rove's client, the state attorney general. I was investigated by the U.S. attorney, who was vetted by Rove and appointed by Bush, who was married to my Republican opponents. Her husband was my Republican opponent's campaign manager. The U.S. attorney's husband was my Republican opponent's campaign manager. The federal judge that was overseeing my case was the trial judge, was one with whom I'd had political battles in the past. He, of course, was vetted by Rove and appointed by Bush as well. I was indicted for something 113 former state attorneys general said was never a crime in the United States. When I was convicted, I realized that our system was flawed, that it could be gamed. I was, at that moment, I reflected on the people whose execution dates I had set as Attorney General. And I recalled some of the people who had applied for clemency while I was governor. And I asked God, in my own way, to forgive me if I had made a mistake. I'm not even sure what I meant by that at that time. But, after delving into what had happened, I knew why and who was behind it, but I didn't know how I could be convicted of something that was only contrived in the minds of the prosecutors. I found that prosecutors get 99% of the indictments they seek across the board, state, local, federal. On average, they get 99% of the indictments they seek. This happens because in 1976, during the cry for war on crime and the war on drugs, the Supreme Court responded by giving prosecutors what amounts to total immunity from civil liability, meaning that they can present false evidence, false testimony, withhold exculpatory evidence without fear of being held accountable civilly. The Brennan Center did a study showing that in 1976, our incarceration rate hovered around 200,000 and then skyrocketed to 1.6 million down the road. The reason prosecutors can get 99% of the indictments they seek is, one, the Supreme Court decision in 1976 giving them total immunity. Congress gave them immunity through the Federal Tort Claims Act, and grand juries are a secret proceeding where there is no lawyer for the victim or for the target. There is no judge to oversee what the prosecutors are doing, so they have free rein to do whatever they want to get the outcome they want out of a grand jury. It's interesting to note that while prosecutors get 99% of the indictments they want, that percentage drops precipitously when white police officers kill a black motorist through the use of excessive force. So we need to think about how we can bring this under control. One, the Supreme Court is not likely to act to reverse what they did in 1976. So it's going to be up to Congress and state leaders to make changes in our laws to restrict the power and the abuse of power by prosecutors. The acceptance of prosecutorial immunity, I think, is underscored by the argument that was made by President Obama's Solicitor General, Elena Kagan, on January the 4th, 2010, when she had her deputy argue to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I quote, that U.S. citizens do not have a constitutional right not to be framed. U.S. citizens do not have a constitutional right not to be framed. That story was broken by David Savage, the legal correspondent of the Los Angeles Times, on January the 5th, 2010. To bring this home, I wanted to go back to voting rights and in the America's history on voting rights started out in a not such a good way. I mean, we restricted the rights of Native Americans, women, and blacks, and of course it got worse after the Civil War, when Jim Crow laws and constitutions were put in place, and then the Ku Klux Klan vigilantes took to the streets and killed lynched untold thousands of black women, men, and children. The effort to reverse that came to light, I think, in large part because of the the blacks in Selma, Alabama, under the leadership of John Lewis and Dr. King, who took to the streets to ensure that the story of the need, the fight for voting rights had to be told. They understood that all of our duties and responsibilities are decided by people whom we elect. So the right to vote, in their judgment, was the most precious right. And that movement that started in Selma marched on across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the steps of the state capitol, where Dr. King said that they would keep marching until George Wallace and the racists and race baiters, trembled away. They marched on to the United States Congress, where the Voting Rights Act was passed, and then to the chambers of the Supreme Court, where one vote, one person, one vote ruling was decreed. It's interesting because Dr. King, during that time in 1968, said that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. He said it was long, but it bends towards justice. Dr. King died in 1968, and we're still waiting for the arc of the moral universe to bend enough so that we can get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed. George Floyd died a couple of years ago, but we're still waiting for the arc of the moral universe to bend enough to pressure Congress to pass restraints against the excessive use of force. And to show you how all of this comes together, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post that was published last week. Alabama has 166 people on death row. 146 of those should not be on death row. Let me explain. 115 of those, 115 of the 146 are there because they were sentenced by non-unanimous juries. Non-unanimous juries is something that was contrived in the 1870s when Black folks first became eligible to serve on juries. Whites decided that they could no longer have unanimous juries because it meant that a single Black juror could prevent someone from being executed. So non-unanimous juries grew out of the old Jim Crow era. Yet in Alabama today, we have 115 people on death row who were sentenced by non-unanimous juries. Secondly, we have 31 people on death row based on what's called judicial overrides. That means where the jury decided life without parole, but the judge decided, no, I'm going to go ahead and kill you anyway. Alabama outlawed judicial overrides in 2017, yet we still have people on death row waiting to be executed under a process that is not legal in any state in the country, including Alabama. It makes absolutely no sense. Again, how do we focus attention and bring change? The Equal Justice Initiative did a study that showed that judicial overrides hovered around 7% in non-election years, but in election years, when judges in Alabama ran for election, judicial overrides jumped to 30%. I think that says it all about judicial overrides. The Death Penalty Information Center did a study in February of 2021 that studied executions in the United States since 1976. And they concluded that for every 8 people executed, 8.3 people executed, 1 person was exonerated, which means that if you look at the statistics, that means we've been getting it wrong about 12% of the time. You know, whether you whether you believe in the death penalty or not, if you believe that the death penalty is a deterrent, I think we can all agree that if we're going to execute people, we ought to at least be trying to execute the person who actually committed the crime. The Death Penalty Information Center went on to, in their study, to show that of the people exonerated from death row, 80% were exonerated because of prosecutorial or police misconduct. And of those people exonerated for prosecutorial or police misconduct, nearly 90%, I think it was 87.9 or 89.7%, were Black people. So that, again, it says that prosecutors were using false evidence, false testimony, or withholding exculpatory evidence to target Black people for murders they did not commit. In 2010, the case that was argued to the Supreme Court involved two young Black teenagers who were targeted by police investigators because they did not want to go down a trail that led them to a white suspect. They convinced a young Black man whom they had picked up at a used car lot or someplace, and they threatened him with prosecution if he did not point the finger at these two Black teenagers. These two people spent 25 years in prison for a crime they clearly did not commit. With that, let me conclude by saying, I ran for governor because I believe that every child, regardless of where they were born or to whom, every child ought to have the right to reach their God-given potential through education. That means universal early learning. That means offering free college to any kid that stays in school and stays out of trouble and makes their grades. I don't believe that the 2020 election was decided because people went to bed at night worrying about Donald Trump. I think they went to bed at night worrying about how they were going to pay their bills, how their parents were going to live, whether their parents and grandparents were going to have enough money for food, for shelter, or to pay their medical expenses. We live in the richest country in the world. I think we should all agree, I think, that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege, that everyone, regardless, no one should go to bed homeless, or hungry or without health care, not those in prison, not the disadvantaged, and not the poor. We voted for a president who believes in justice, who believes in social justice, equal justice, racial justice, environmental justice, and in criminal justice reform. Clearly, something is wrong when we have nearly 2 million people incarcerated in this country. Many of them, most of them, in fact, enter prison without any job skills and leave the same way. We have got to turn our prison system right side up. From the days of the cries for a war on crime and a war on drugs, there was one focus, and that was to put people in prison and keep them off the streets. It was a system for warehousing, not for rehabilitation, not for education, not to give them social skills or job skills. We have got to ensure that beginning on day one, those people that we lock up, look, prisons may not be the best place for us to reverse or change behavior, but it's our last best chance to do that. Secondly, we've got to repeal the immunity in the Federal Tort Claims Act. And I think we need to give serious thought to putting a lawyer for the victim of the use of excessive force by police in a grand jury. Let me ask this question to those listening. How many of you believe that George Zimmerman would have been set free in the Trayvon Martin case if Benjamin Crump had been sitting in the grand jury as a check on truth to what the prosecutor was presenting against George Floyd? the second point I want to make is grand jurors, unlike juries for civil and criminal trials, grand jurors are not voir dire. They're not questioned about their prejudices. For all we know, the grand jurors in the Breonna Taylor case, the grand jurors might have been related to the police or members of the Klan themselves, because no one was allowed to ask them the serious questions that would have ensured that they were fair and impartial. So we need to press Congress and state legislators to institute a process where grand jurors are questioned. And in my view, there ought to be a lawyer present for the target and for the victim, if it's a victim of the use of excessive force, so we can have a check on truth of what the prosecutors are presenting in grand juries. Let me conclude by saying, I believe that this country can become whatever it is that we want it to be and what it should be. But it starts with the right to vote. The right to vote today is under attack in the capital of Montgomery, Alabama. They're about to pass a bill that would make it a criminal offense for an employer to hand a worker an application for an absentee ballot. Instead of making it easier to vote, we are doing everything we can to make it more difficult, which means that the job for us is even that much harder. I believe that change will come for the better. That arc of the moral universe will bend toward justice when we get out and work hard enough and long enough to bend the arc so that we can elect people to public office who will make this state, this state, all states in our country, everything that we know it can and should be. That's. I'm sorry, I got carried away, but thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Governor Siegelman. You're an inspiration and a truly great role model. I know you endured tremendous injustice in opposing Karl Rove. We had our own experiences with Karl Rove in Ohio 2004, same time he was going after you. And I'm not going to press you, but if you want to explain what you went through at some point, that I'm sure we would all welcome it. But you have an op-ed. Eileen sent me the link to your op-ed on the death penalty. I noticed you were joined in your opposition to the death penalty by another former governor of Alabama. Is that right?
Yes, Robert Bentley is a Republican, and I took the draft down to him, and he was more than happy to sign on. And you know, I live in a Republican state. That's the House and Senate is dominated by Republicans, and we have a Republican governor. So it was good to have a Republican former governor, Robert Bentley, join me in this editorial. We're fighting an uphill battle, but I think if you believe what Dr. King said, we have to hope that the arc of the moral universe will bend toward justice in the case of those on death row in Alabama.
Well, it always astounds me how people who claim to be pro-life can turn around and support the death penalty. I mean, we are 100% certain that the death penalty results in the death of innocent people. There's simply no doubt about that. And I won't go further. I mean, it's very clear what we're saying.
Let me just remark on that one point. And while I was Attorney General, I was able to get one person off of death row. We were able to find exculpatory evidence, and his name was Johnny Harris. And I had an occasion to spend a few minutes with him just a few years ago, and it was very touching. It was a very emotional and powerful encounter that we had. But while I was governor in the year 2000, there was an execution. I had after becoming more aware of the power of prosecutors and their ability to withhold exculpatory evidence, I was able to work with some interns from Georgetown and from other parts of the country to study the cases that came before me as governor. And now, 23 years later, after this execution that occurred in 2000, I believe that the person who was executed was wrongfully charged, wrongfully convicted, and wrongfully executed. It became clear over the 23 years, evidence started to emerge. The evidence wasn't there when I was governor, but over the last 23 years, evidence started to emerge that the prosecutor withheld exculpatory evidence. So this man, Freddie Lee Wright, would probably have been convicted, but he certainly would not have been convicted of capital murder had the prosecution played fair.
Boy, that's something else. I do want to say, if I read it correctly, I thought I saw, and somebody can correct me, a news story today saying the Governor DeSantis of Florida wants to allow the death penalty in jury verdicts that are 8-4.
That's right.
In
Yeah.
other words, did I read that right?
Yes. Yeah. I call him Governor Ron DeSenseless, but anyway.
Well, you're better than Trump with that one. That's good.
He is, well, thank you. In his effort to be tough on crime, he joined Alabama in being the only state, as far as I know, and we've studied this, we can't find any other state that allows people to be sentenced to death based on a non-unanimous jury recommendation. Alabama has a 10-2 jury vote for a death sentence, which is, again, is a relic of the Jim Crow era. I mean, how we're living in 2023, for goodness sakes, and we're still using a method that was devised in the minds of racists after the Civil War, so it would make it easier for them to kill people.
Man, it's just really earth-shattering. We have Bruce Strauss wants to say another word to you from Alabama, and then I want to go to John Brakey in Arizona. I want to make sure that you know each other. Ruth, go ahead, and then John Brakey, please.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that, Don, you're extremely principled because you did not mention at all the horror story that you went through. And people really should go back and research Scott Horton, not the one that does anti-war, but the professor international law at Columbia. And he did a series of articles in Harper's. And it really reads like, unfortunately, a mystery thriller, except the victim is Don. The other thing that's amazing is, as you know, everybody here knows that the Supreme Court ruled against the people in Alabama who surprisingly wanted to get rid of gerrymandering to get another Black district to be represented. So the Supreme Court has not, helped that situation. And finally, Karl Rove ended up being, I believe, president of University of Texas. So I do not want to smoke what they were smoking when they made that decision. Anyway, thank you so much, Don.
Yes, and we could do a couple of shows on Karl Rove, but we won't. And Don, when people should know your story. If
well, let me just mention the. Of course, I wrote a book. It's called Stealing Our Democracy. It's a nonfiction. I name Karl Rove. I name a sitting judge on the 11th Circuit, who was Karl Rove's political client, then the Attorney General of Alabama. I named the U.S. Attorney and explained exactly how they were conflicted. But the good part about the nonfiction is if it's true, you can print it. Well, I haven't been served in 2 years with any kind of notice that they objected to anything I said. So I would encourage people, if you're interested in my story, you can buy the book, or I really like the Audible book because I do it. It's my own voice. Amazon offered, people to read it for me, but I wanted to read it myself. So, and the other thing, there was a documentary done by an independent filmmaker. It's a lot shorter than my Audible book. Audible book is about 12 hours, but the documentary is about an hour and a half. And it's entitled Atticus versus the Architect. And I think it's still available on Amazon for like $3. So Atticus versus the Architect, or Stealing Our Democracy. And you can, occasionally I'll say something worth listening to. So if you want to follow me, you can do that at Don Siegelman.
Wow.
There.
Okay. Steve Caruso has graciously put up Stealing Our Democracy. I will definitely get it. And we're really grateful to you, Don, for your incredible courage. We have had someone on with a parallel story, Steve Donziger. I don't know if Steve is with us today, but I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Donziger's.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a terrible story. I mean,
he's you guys are unfortunately have been in similar situations. I want to introduce you to, we'll call on Sue and Dennis. Well, let me get Dennis in a minute, then we're going to do John Brakey. I know, Dennis, you might have to run for your show. So can you introduce yourself to Don and make sure you get him on flashpoints? Dennis Bernstein, go ahead. Are you unmuted? Let's unmute you. Always frustrating. Oh, there you go.
I'm unmuted.
Dennis, are you
Hi,
good?
Don. This is John Brakey.
I got it.
In
Sorry.
2008. Am I going on the wrong time? Okay.
Wait, yeah, let me get Dennis on first.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Dennis usually has to run to his show. I'm going to be on later too. Go ahead.
I think you got me now. Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Terrific. Governor, thank you for the amazing work you've done. It's a lot of courage. I've spent a lot of years investigating sort of the serious kind of voter fraud where Black people throughout the South lose their right to vote. They try and report that they've been their church has been burned, and it turns into an investigation of how it wasn't actually their church, but they were committing voter fraud, and so they had a fight with the next church over the way, all the kinds of stories to avoid really giving people the right to vote. Now I'm watching, and I really wonder what you think about this. The way in which, for instance, in Jackson, Mississippi, and in Selma, Alabama, and we know that the core of the Black community, the power is in the city, and the white people control the state governments. And it does seem now that there's a new movement to usurp the power of the cities, of Black people in the cities, so that, for instance, I mean, in Jackson, it turns into a battle to have clean drinking water.
Don, do you want to comment on that? Dennis, by the way, as I mentioned, is the host of the Flashpoint show, which is on at 5 o'clock Pacific time in Berkeley, and it's syndicated nationwide. And I'll be Dennis's guest this evening, and I'm sure he'll have you on at another time. You want to comment on it? And then we'll go to John.
Well, Dennis, yeah, you're on the right track, of course. And it makes it more difficult when you're in a red state where most of the white people who are in power are Republicans, and they have very little contact with people in the inner city or in rural Alabama, for example. So there is very little empathy or political reason for the majority of people in the House and Senate in Alabama, for them to have an interest in what is going on in these smaller, particularly rural cities. And they are struggling, and they struggle with healthcare issues, and they, of course, struggle with having the resources to provide a decent education. So yeah, you're right. I encourage you and applaud you for what you're doing.
Well, be
Thank
sure
you.
and
Thank you.
exchange your contacts with Dennis so he can have you on, Don. He's a great, and very important radio host. I want to, Sue and Wendy and Mary will get to you in a couple of minutes. I do want to, did invite John Brakey to come on. Governor John Brakey is one of our most important election protection activists. He's done tremendously powerful work in Arizona. And John, will you introduce yourself to the governor, please?
Well, absolutely. Governor, we've met before. It's an honor to see you again. I am glad that you're healthy, and I'm sorry for everything you went through. I remember exactly, because I've been doing this work now for 19 years, and your case is one of the cases that I investigated. And I had the opportunity to go to Alabama in the 2017 for the Roy Moore election, which was just an incredible story that we won a court case in the morning. And me and my lawyer, who is out of DC, he's Barack Obama's attorney, he's a major election expert across the country, Chris Sauter. We were driving from Alabama to another city to go somewhere, and we got a phone call that they had appealed our case. And they appealed it in like 6 hours and didn't even give us notice before they overturned it. And we were just blown away by the whole thing. And then at the very end, Roy Moore was upset because they did do that, because what we were trying to do and what I do is that our whole country's gone digital. And these machines don't count the ballot, they count the picture. And to make a long story short, Arizona, hopefully, even though our bill got vetoed by the governor, and that we will have elections in my state, that 2 days after the canvass, a precinct committee man or anybody can download a cast vote record for their precinct and then sit there and analyze. And then afterwards, after everything adds up really good, because, you know, we call this bill the big lie killer. We also call it the impunity buster. We take away anybody's impunity to steal by making the system transparent, trackable, publicly verified with a ballot library. And I hope to get your contact information after this, the show or whatever. I'm very close to Mimi Kennedy. You know, we have a forum that we're going to be doing Thursday night in Arizona that will be broadcast on Facebook, Twitter, and all over the place, where we will have some really dignitaries in our state, because, you know, my bill got vetoed, but believe it or not, I had 3 weeks to try to override it because they took a 3-week lead, which is really incredible. And you know, the Democrats, I was able, because I'm a Democrat lifelong, okay, but my business card says very clearly what I do is not about the right or left, it's all about right and wrong. And I have to be nonpartisan in my work. And it's interesting, you know, how things are working. But anyway, getting back to it, you're a role model for me, sir. Everything you've gone through and everything you've had to do, you know, I'm thankful that there's people out there like you who have heart, and you didn't come out bitter. You came out making change and still fighting. You're a brother from a different mother to me.
Well, who knows? Maybe the same mother. You never know. I do want to say, I want to explain, Governor Siegelman, that John Brakey has pioneered the method of digital ballot images, where we rely on paper ballots, hand-marked paper ballots, which are then scanned into digital readers. And so the combination, because we in Ohio 2004 were victimized by Karl Rove in the presidential election. On election day, Karl Rove and George W. Bush in 2004 went one place. They went to Columbus to talk to and give instructions to the Secretary of State of Ohio as to how to deal with the 2004 election, which we are 100% was, shall we say, had major discrepancies. And it was a lot of it in 2004. Most of it really was done on touchscreen voting machines, which were very easily flipped. Now,
Well, you know,
and coming out of that, we went to paper ballots, hand-marked paper ballots with digital scanners, which was the predominant mode of election in 2020. So this is a very successful election protection movement, and John Brakey has been at the heart of it. So go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
well, I was just going to comment because I'm sure you probably remember that the Kiplinger letter said that all I needed to do to be this dark horse candidate in the fashion of Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton to break the Republican stronghold on the South was to win my reelection in 2002. And that's when Karl Rove's client, the Attorney General Bill Pryor, started his investigation. The night of the election, I won. I was declared by the Associated Press, CBS, NBC, all the networks as the winner. I went to bed. I was awakened about 4 o'clock in the morning and by security telling me that they were stealing the election in this small county in Alabama. What happened, Karl Rove's deputy, her name was Kelly Robertson. I think her name at the time was Kelly Kimbrough, but she's still around. She was the White House deputy for Karl Rove. She was in Alabama overseeing and doing Karl Rove's work and was sitting at the desk with the Republican Party chairman when the elections results were posted showing that I was going to win the election. They then called the probate judge, and within 4 minutes, after the polls had closed, the poll workers and watchers had left, the media had left the courthouse. 4 minutes later, a new set of returns were posted with 6,000 of my votes being mysteriously vanished. What was a telltale sign of voter fraud was that not a single down ballot race, not the lieutenant governor, state treasurer, auditor, U.S. senator, no other race was impacted by a single vote. But my total I had lost by a little over they had subtracted a little over 6,000 votes, which swung the election to my Republican opponent. I asked for a hand recount of only one precinct. And the Attorney General, Karl Rove's client, came in, seized the ballots, seized the cassette tapes, seized the scanners, and took everything to Montgomery. And none of that has been seen since. They then illegally certified my Republican opponent as the winner of the 2002 election. I say illegally. I believe that if we had had a recount, I would have won that election and the story would have been different. But that's when my trouble began, because I told them at that point, okay, you've got me in a sort of a catch-22, because Alabama law said that you cannot contest an election unless you can prove that there were enough illegal votes cast or enough legal votes not counted to make a difference in the outcome. Well, I couldn't do either of those because the Attorney General had seized the ballots and wouldn't give them to us. So I said, okay, I can't contest the election because you stole it. And I'm going to come back and fight again another day. And that's when the heat started being turned up, and I was convicted of something that never happened. So anyway.
Unbelievable. I want to say very quickly, we have 70 people on the call. We are ending the first hour. Of those of you listening in, on Progressive Radio Network on Thursday evening. We're going to switch over now. The second hour will not be on the radio there. You can come to electionprotection2024.org. electionprotection2024.org to see the continuation of this discussion, as you're probably going to be leaving PRN right now. I want to stay with you, Don Siegelman. Sue Dorfman has a hand that wants to ask you a question, then Wendy and Mary. Sue Dorfman, go ahead, please. Let's get you unmuted.
Yes, Governor. My question is how do we get, or how do you think the best way of getting attention paid to states such as Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas in terms of the implications of what is happening in terms of voting rights in those states? And parenthetically, I'm wondering if you could just weigh in a minute or two about what you think of the current Mississippi governor's race.
Well, I really don't know anything about the Mississippi governor's race. I'm gonna have to leave that to people in Mississippi to educate me. But you know, the only thing I know is either we start, reinventing what Dr. King and Fred Shuttlesworth and John Lewis were doing. And there was an old saying back in those days: raise hell and go to jail. And that's what they did to get attention to the fact that they were not being allowed to register and vote. Now I think we're at instead of being in a catch-22, I think again we just have to work longer and harder and smarter, perhaps. But we have got to turn out. We've got to turn out, every single vote we can to elect good people to public office, so that we can make the changes that we all want to see made. Starting with, getting the John Lewis voting rights bill passed.
Boy, it's amazing what you're up against. Okay, Wendy, and then Jeffrey will give you a quick question, and Mary. Wendy Lederman in Florida.
Thank you, Harvey. And thank you so much, Governor. That was really just a profound presentation. I mean, really almost brought me to tears in some parts there, because I mean, the suffering is so real. We think of it in abstract concepts, but people are rotting in jail for no reason and spend their lives and lose everything. I'm in Florida, so that kind of says a lot. My first yeah, it says it all. My first election was the Bush election, where I was watching the local news say that Gore won Dade County, and then half an hour later the national news is saying otherwise. So I was kind of radicalized then. What's happening now, just speaking about the lowering the unanimous vote for juries to be able to execute people. There's also another bill that just passed that protects cops from excessive force. They can't be prosecuted for it. Basically, they'd get 180 days written notice before any kind of any can't think of the word, but disciplinary action, any a defamation. So it's really frightening. You have to be 30 feet away from the police to be able to film them. And what's even more terrifying is that DeSantis is now going for $100 million private police force to support the National Guard. They would have all the toys of the military. They would have arrest powers. They would be trained and supported by Israeli private forces. It'd be I think it's 1,500 volunteers, so I could just see the Proud Boys all lining up, and it can be used for pretty much anything he would want to do. So I'm just imagining these people at the polling places, guarding polling places. We saw all the people get arrested for voting last year. So I'm inspired by everything that you're saying and just kind of sharing this information. I don't know if I really have a specific question, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. And I just really want to applaud you and just tell you to keep doing what you're doing, because I mean, you've just such an incredible way of presenting this information. And you apologized for getting intense, but I really appreciate that you did. And I just hope you keep at it. Thank you so much.